Well, today is Saturday. It is June the 26th. It's my joy to come to you with today's devotional from 1 Samuel chapter 7 and 8. The title of the devotional is Be Careful What You Ask For. You may regret it. Now, we're going to pick up our study in 1 Samuel chapter 7. Verse 1. Now, the men of Kiriath Jearim came, and they fetched up the ark of the Lord, and they brought it into the house of Abinadab in the hill, and they sanctified Eleazar his son to keep the ark of the Lord. Now, remembering that Eli and his sons were dead, the decision to carry the ark of the Lord from Beth Shemesh into the house of Abinadab may have been a temporary plan for sheltering the ark, but it extended into 20 years. And we read in 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 2 that all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. Now, though the Philistines had claimed the victory over Israel, it was the Lord who brought their enemies to the decision to return the ark, and then the people cried out to the Lord. Well, with the deaths of Eli and his son, the stage was set for Samuel to judge Israel as the prophet of the Lord. Now, Samuel called upon Israel to turn to the Lord, and I'm going to quote now, to put away their strange gods and prepare their hearts unto the Lord, to serve him only, and the Lord would deliver them out of the hand of the Philistines. 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 3. Well, Israel obeyed, and the nation gathered at Mizpah, a military outpost, and there in a service that was full of symbolism, water was poured out in a symbolic act of repentance and purification. And we read in verse 6 that the people fasted and they confessed their sins against the Lord. Well, the Philistines heard how Israel was gathered at Mizpah, and they determined to go to war against them. Fearing the Philistines, the people called on Samuel to intercede for them. And in 1 Samuel 7 and verse 8, cease not to cry unto the Lord our God for us, that he will save us out of the hand of the Philistines. Well, Samuel offered a burnt offering, and in verse 9 he cried unto the Lord for Israel, and the Lord heard him. And we read this wonderful moment of God's intervention. As the Philistines came near, the Lord thundered with a great thunder on that day upon the Philistines, so that the Philistine soldiers were thrown into confusion. And we read in verse 11 that Israel pursued the Philistines and smote them. Well, Samuel decided to raise up a memorial to that victory. And in 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 12, he raises up a great stone, and he names it Ebenezer, which means the stone of the help of the Lord. It was to be a lasting memorial that Israel should look to the Lord for the victory. Well, Samuel had judged Israel all the days of his life, 1 Samuel 7 and verse 13. And the Lord gave the nation peace from war with the Philistines throughout his reign. Well, with the ark no longer at Shiloh, we read that Samuel returned to Ramah, his childhood home, and there he judged Israel, and there he built an altar unto the Lord. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 8 introduces us to a tragic time. It's a sad time, for we have here the closing years of Samuel's life, and we'll notice that they were filled with sorrow and disappointment. In his old age, he had made his sons judge in civil matters. However, those sons, we read in chapter 8 and verse 3, walked not in his ways, but they turned aside after lucre, and they took bribes and perverted judgment. They were on the take, if you would. Samuel's heart must have been breaking. For the elders of Israel came to him, and they observed, in verse 5, thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. Well, Samuel was discouraged and disappointed, and he prayed, and the Lord consoled him, saying, verse 7, hearken unto the voice of the people, in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, Samuel, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. The Lord reminded Samuel how Israel had rejected him since he had delivered them out of Egypt unto that very day. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verses 9 through 18, the Lord counseled Samuel, heed the demands of the people, but remind them of all that they will suffer under the reign of a king. Their sons, Samuel told the people, would be taken from your homes, and they will serve the king's pleasure. Samuel warned their daughters would labor in the king's kitchen, and they would serve his table. The king would take their fields and their vineyards and their olive gardens and give them to his officers. They would pay tithes, taxes, you might say, of their possessions to support the king's palace and his armies. And the king would require their servants and put them to work at his bidding. And Samuel warned in verse 18, and you shall cry out in that day because of your king, that is the hardships that your king will bring upon you, which you have chosen. But the Lord will not hear you in that day. And yet, nevertheless, the people were obstinate, and they refused to heed Samuel's warnings. In 1 Samuel 8 and verse 19 and 20, in spite of the Lord's desire to be a benevolent king and rule Israel through his law and his commandments, the people rejected the Lord. And they demanded, nay, but we will have a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us, and go out before us, and fight our battles. Israel now is set to leave behind the era of the judges that rule according to the law and the commandments, and now put a king over them. A king that will enslave them to his will, his desires, and even his passions. And we will notice in our next study that first king will be Saul, and he will be all that Samuel had warned he would be. And the nation would suffer. God gave them the victory over the Philistines in chapter 7, but they rejected him. And they wanted to be like all the other nations. Isn't that like us today? The average Christian in America today and the average church wants to be like the world. And as a result of that, we're reaping God's judgment. Join me tomorrow as we continue our study, our chronological reading of the Bible, looking at 1 Samuel. God bless and bye-bye.